The old man drew a derringer from his coat and pointed it at her face. "Step down off that porch," he said calmly. "We are going home." Three things happened at once. The middle brother stepped between her and the gun. The youngest brother fired from the hip. And the eldest brother, the one she had married not 12 minutes ago, stood beside her and did not move at all. She came west with $2 in a letter. She did not know that by noon, three identical mountain men would bleed for her on the porch of a fortress she had not yet learned to call home. This is her story. Stay with me. The mud in Iron Creek was thick enough to swallow a boot hole and mean enough to keep it. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the edge of the wooden platform of the train station, her $2 clutched so tightly in her gloved hand that the coins had grown warm against her palm. The train that had carried her across half a continent was already wheezing back to life behind her, its whistle a thin and lonesome sound that seemed to mock the vast emptiness ahead. She had imagined this moment for 43 days, ever since she had pressed her wax seal onto a letter she could not unsend. She had imagined a man waiting for her with a wagon and a coat draped over his arm. She had imagined a town with a steeple and a butcher and a woman who might offer her bread and a kind word. Iron Creek had a steeple, it had a butcher, but the woman who came toward her now was not the kind sort. Eleanor was 24 years old and had not eaten in 2 days. Her honey-colored hair had escaped its modest pins during the long hours on the train, and now soft tendrils framed a face gone pale from the altitude. Her cornflower blue eyes, the eyes her late father had said held the whole color of a Boston summer sky, scanned the muddy street for any sign of the man whose letter she carried folded against her heart. She wore a navy blue traveling dress, fitted but tasteful with delicate lace at the cuffs and a small cameo brooch at her throat. The dress was the last thing of value her Aunt Margaret had not yet sold. Eleanor had stitched the cameo into the lining herself the night before she fled because she knew her aunt would search her trunk for it. The trunk was gone, lost somewhere between Chicago and Denver, the porter had told her, with a shrug that suggested he had seen many trunks lost and many young women weeping over them. Eleanor had not wept. She had simply stood very still until the feeling passed. A small heart-shaped face, aristocratic cheekbones, a mouth that had not smiled in many days. The mountains rose around the town like the walls of a fortress, snow already crowning their highest peaks, though it was only the middle of October. Eleanor had read about the Rocky Mountains in a geography book at the Parlor Library in Boston. The book had used words like majestic and sublime. The book had not mentioned the way the wind here could cut through wool like a knife. The book had not mentioned the smell of coal smoke and horse manure and something wilder underneath, something that whispered of distances no civilized woman should have to cross. A handful of townspeople had gathered on the boardwalk. They were watching her. Eleanor recognized the kind of watching it was. She had been watched that way at her Aunt Margaret's parlor, too, the day Mr. Cornelius Pemberton had come to inspect her the way a buyer inspects a horse he intends to break. Before we go on, my friends, if you are new here, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. I share new frontier stories every week, stories of love forged in hard country and lives rebuilt by the slow grace of time. And tell me in the comments below, where in the world are you listening from tonight? I read every one. Now back to the snow and the mud and the woman with $2. A door slammed open across the street. A heavy-set woman in a stained brown apron strode out onto the boardwalk, hands planted on wide hips, mouth already curled into the sort of smile that has nothing to do with kindness. This was Mrs. Wexler, who ran the only boarding house in Iron Creek, and Mrs. Wexler had seen many young women step off that train, clutching letters from hopeful men. She had also seen most of them step right back on within the week. "You waiting for the Hawthorne men?" the woman called across the street. Her voice carried easily in the thin mountain air. There was no kindness in it. There was something almost like pity, but the kind of pity that enjoys itself. Eleanor turned. She lifted her chin in the way her mother had taught her long ago, before the consumption had taken her mother and then her father and then everything else. "I am," Eleanor said. Her voice was soft, but it did not tremble. "I am Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. My letter was answered by a Mr. S. Hawthorne. I was told he would meet me here." A few of the men on the boardwalk laughed. It was a low, ugly laugh the kind men make when they believe a woman cannot understand the joke. Mrs. Wexler crossed the street, her boots making wet, sucking sounds in the mud. She stopped a few feet from Eleanor and looked her up and down, taking in the dress, the cameo, the soft, pale hands that had clearly never split kindling. "Mrs. Whitmore," the woman said, drawing the name out like she was tasting something sour. "You are the third one this year." Eleanor felt her heart slow, then quicken. The third one. The third one, Mrs. Wexler repeated. The first one was a widow from St. Louis. She lasted 6 hours in the wagon, asked to be turned around before they reached the timber. The second was a girl from Pittsburgh. She made it to the cabin. She stayed 3 days. She came back down the mountain on her own 2 feet in a snowstorm, and she did not stop walking until she was on a train going east. Now here you are, Boston by the look of you, pretty as a painting, and you have not yet asked the right question. Eleanor's mouth had gone dry. She forced the words out. What is the right question? Mrs. Wexler smiled. The smile pulled at her face like a wound. The right question, child, is how many of them there are. The wind shifted. Somewhere up the street, a horse stamped and snorted. Eleanor felt the letter inside her bodice, warm against her skin where she had kept it for safekeeping. She had read the letter so many times she could see the lines of it behind her closed eyes. The letter had said, "We will be waiting for you at Iron Creek on the 15th of October. We She had thought it a slip of the pen, the way men of few words sometimes mistake their pronouns. She had told herself it was nothing. How many she heard herself say? 3, Mrs. Wexler said, and the word landed like a dropped stone. 3 brothers, triplets born on the same hour, the same day, and they looked so much alike that even their own mother could not tell them apart. God rest her soul. They came up out of the east after the war, built themselves a fortress on the high ridge 30 miles from any neighbor. They keep to themselves. They pay in hard coin. They speak when they have to and not before. And these last few years, child, they have been collecting children. Children, Eleanor whispered. 4 of them, Mrs. Wexler said. Picked up off the road, fished out of the gutter, taken in from God knows where. 4 orphans up there in that cabin, and 3 bearded mountain men, and not a woman among them since the eldest brother's wife died of the fever 8 years ago. Now you tell me, Mrs. Whitmore, did the letter mention the brothers? Did it mention the children? Eleanor could not feel her hands. She had imagined a man. One man. A widower, perhaps, with a small son who needed a mother. She had imagined teaching that son his letters by the fire, pouring her late father's coffee for a quiet husband at dawn. She had imagined a single hard life that was still a small life, a life she could fit her arms around. 3 brothers, 4 children. It did not, she said. The letter did not mention them. Of course it did not, Mrs. Wexler said. Mrs. Wexler's pity was warming now, becoming something almost protective in its cruelty. Listen to me, child. There is a coach back to Denver tomorrow morning. I will give you a bed tonight for 50 cents, and you can pay me when you reach your people. You go home. There is no shame in it. No woman in her right mind takes on 3 rough men and 4 wild children and a cabin 100 miles from a doctor. You go home. Eleanor did not have a home. Eleanor had $2 and a brooch sewn into a dress and an aunt in Boston who had already auctioned off her grandmother's china. Eleanor had a man named Cornelius Pemberton waiting for her in a brownstone on Beacon Hill, a man who had buried 3 wives, a man whose 3rd wife had been found at the bottom of the staircase with her neck broken, and the household staff suddenly enriched into silence. Eleanor had read of him in the back pages of the Boston papers before her Aunt Margaret had ever spoken his name. Eleanor had nowhere to go that was not worse than nowhere. Before she could answer Mrs. Wexler, the air changed. It was the way the townspeople went still that told her first. The laughter on the boardwalk died. A man with a cigar took it slowly out of his mouth. A boy who had been throwing a stick for a yellow dog put a hand on the dog's collar and pulled it close. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And then from the far end of the street came the sound of hooves. Not 1 set of hooves, not 2, 3 horses riding abreast, moving at the steady, measured pace of men who do not hurry because they have never once in their lives been afraid of being late. The sound carried up the muddy street like a slow drum beat, and as it came closer, Eleanor saw the townspeople step back from the edge of the boardwalk, drawing their children behind them. Mrs. Wexler herself took a half step away from Eleanor, as if proximity to the new arrivals might soil her. 3 riders, 3 black hats, 3 coats of dark bison hide that hung past their boots, 3 rifles slung across 3 broad backs. They came out of the gray light of the afternoon like figures cut from the same piece of stone, and as they drew nearer, Eleanor understood in a way that no description could have prepared her for that. Mrs. Wexler had spoken plainly. They were the same height, 6 feet and 4 inches if they were a span, the same broad shoulders worked into shape by years of labor and cold, the same dark hair under the same wide-brimmed hats, the same hard set of the jaw, the same weathered tan, the same long, strong hands resting on the same kind of leather rein. 3 of them, identical, riding toward her like judgment. A 4th shape sat behind the rider on the right, a small shape bundled in a coat too large for her 2 skinny legs and wool stockings sticking out beneath, a child, a girl. Her hair, the little Eleanor could see of it, was the pale gold of dry grass. The riders pulled up in the middle of the street, perhaps 20 paces from where Eleanor stood. The horses stamped and blew steam into the cold air. The middle rider, the one closest to the boardwalk, swung down first, and his boots hit the mud with a soft, heavy sound that Eleanor felt in her chest. The other two dismounted at the same moment as though they shared a single mind and a single signal. Now, Eleanor could see the differences. They were small. They were the kind of differences only a careful watcher would notice. The middle brother, the one who had dismounted first, had a long, pale scar running down his left cheek from the corner of his eye to the line of his beard. The brother to his right had a rope of old burn scar wrapped around his right forearm, where his sleeve had been pushed back to reveal it, the skin shining and tight. The brother to his left had no visible scars, only a small dark mole high on his cheekbone just below his right eye, like a punctuation mark on an otherwise unmarked page. The middle brother, the scar, he was the one who looked at her. His eyes, Eleanor saw, were the color of strong honey held up to a lamp. They were not unkind. They were not kind either. They were the eyes of a man who had been awake for a very long time and had stopped being surprised by anything the world might do to him. He took her in with one slow look from the muddy hem of her travel dress to the loose tendrils of hair around her face, and Eleanor felt herself flush despite the cold. Then the small shape behind the third rider moved. The child swung down, slid off the side of the horse with the easy, practiced motion of a child who had been riding since before she could walk, and landed in the mud with a delighted little splash. She was perhaps 7 years old. She had a heart-shaped face smudged with what might have been jam and what might have been dirt. She had two front teeth that were a touch too big for her smile, and two cornflower blue eyes that were, Eleanor noticed, with a small lurch in her chest, almost the same color as her own. The girl looked at Eleanor, the girl looked at Mrs. Wexler, the girl looked at the men of the town who were watching all of this and saying nothing, and the girl planted her small fists on her hips and shouted in a voice fit for a parade ground, "Do not say it!" Mrs. Wexler had opened her mouth. She closed it. The girl marched across the mud, pulled up short of Eleanor by perhaps 3 feet, and tilted her head all the way back to look up at her. "You are the lady from Boston," the girl announced. Eleanor's voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "I am. I am Adelaide," the girl said with the dignity of a small queen. "Addie, mostly. I am 7. Uncle Silas wrote the letter, but I helped him with the spelling because he gets the I before E rule wrong. Behind the girl, the middle brother, the one with the scar, made a sound that might have been a sigh or might have been the first half of a laugh that he had not let himself finish. I told them Adelaide went on her cornflower eyes fierce now that all the ladies in town said no woman would come for 3 men with 4 babies, and I told them that was a stupid thing for ladies to say because someone would come if they only asked nice enough, and Uncle Silas said the letter was nice, and Uncle Cassius said the letter was too short, and Uncle Ezekiel said it did not matter what the letter said because no one was coming anyway. And I said, she drew herself up. I said someone would come, and she came, so you can all stop saying it now. Ooh. The girl turned and pointed an accusing finger at Mrs. Wexler. "Especially you." Mrs. Wexler made a flustered noise. The men on the boardwalk did not laugh this time. One of them, an older man with a tin star on his vest, stepped down into the mud. He removed his hat in a way that was meant to be polite and was in fact the first courtesy Eleanor had been shown in Iron Creek. "Mrs. Whitmore," the man said, "Sheriff Hollister at your service. Now, I do not mean to interfere in a private matter, but I have been sheriff of this town 12 years, and I have seen enough mail order arrangements gone bad to feel it is my Christian duty to say a word. The Hawthorne brothers are honest men. I will swear to that in any court. But what they are asking of a young woman is not a usual thing. 3 men, 4 children, a ridge so high the snow does not melt off it until June. Boston is a long way to come to find out you do not want to stay." Behind the sheriff, a woman in a stiff gray dress and a pinched gray face had emerged from the offices of what appeared to be the church. Mrs. Pickering. Eleanor could read the name later on a wooden sign. For now, Eleanor only saw the way the woman's mouth worked itself into a shape of moral concern. "It is not decent," Mrs. Pickering said. 3 men and 1 woman in 1 cabin. It is not decent, and it is not Christian, and the welfare society of this county will not stand for it. Those children should be in a proper home with a proper married couple, not on some mountain with 3 bachelors and a stranger. Eleanor felt the world begin to narrow. Her $2, her stolen brooch, her empty stomach. The faces of the townspeople who were not cruel, exactly, only certain that no woman would stay, certain that this was already over, certain that in the morning Eleanor would board the coach back to Denver, and from there back to Boston, and from there into the house of Cornelius Pemberton, and they would all forget her by the spring thaw. She had imagined a man with a wagon. She had imagined a quiet, small life. She had not imagined three identical men standing in a row in the mud, and a child with her own blue eyes shouting at the sky, in a town that had already counted her as the third failure of the year. The middle brother, the one with the scar, stepped forward. He moved like a man who knew exactly how much room he took up in the world. He stopped a respectful distance from Eleanor, 2 arm lengths, and he did not loom. He did something more difficult than that. He made himself small in the only way a man of his size could make himself small. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands in front of him the way a man holds a hat in church or at a funeral. His hair beneath was dark and a little too long, and there was gray in it at the temples. Though he could not have been 40, his honey-colored eyes met hers and stayed there. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice, Lord above his voice, it was low and it was quiet and it had the weight of stone in cold water. Eleanor would remember that voice all her life, and on the day she died in a feather bed surrounded by grandchildren, she would remember that this was the first thing he ever said to her. Mrs. Whitmore, my name is Silas Hawthorne. The man on my right is my brother Cassius. The man on my left is my brother Ezekiel. We are the three of us 38 years old. We are the three of us in good health. We have a good cabin and a good barn and good water and meat in the smokehouse for the winter. We have 4 children ages 15, 7, 4, and 10 months. The eldest we found ourselves. The others were brought to us by people who could not keep them. They are not our blood, but they are our family. He paused. He glanced at his brothers. Cassius gave a small short nod. Ezekiel did the same. 3 identical men, 3 identical nods. It looked, Eleanor thought, like a single man reflected in 3 mirrors. Silas turned back to her. I will not lie to you in front of God and these people. The letter was short. The letter did not say that there were 3 of us. That was my fault. I did not know how to write it in a way that would not frighten a stranger. My brothers and I share a home and a life. We share the work and the children, but only one man would be your husband, and if you stay, that man would be me. My brothers will live in their own quarters. They will treat you as a sister and nothing more. There will be no impropriety. You have my word, and the word of a Hawthorne is not given lightly. Mrs. Pickering made a small, disapproving sound. Sheriff Hollister did not. Silas went on. He spoke to her as though they were the only 2 people in the muddy street, as though the townspeople and his brothers and the small, fierce girl were all only weather, and Eleanor was the one steady thing. I will not ask you to decide this minute. The cabin is 30 miles up. The light is going. There is snow tonight. My brothers and I have business in town, supplies to load, a letter to send to a man in Denver. That will take the better part of an hour. Mrs. Wexler will give you tea and a place to sit. When we are loaded, we will come for you. If by then you have decided that you do not wish to come up the mountain, you will say so, and that is the end of it. I will pay your board at Mrs. Wexler's tonight, and I will pay your fare back to Boston in the morning, and there will be no debt between us. You may keep the dress. You may keep your dignity. You will not owe me a thing. He paused. The wind moved through the pines beyond the town and made a sound like a long, slow breath. But Silas said, and the word fell quiet between them, if you do come up the mountain, Mrs. Whitmore, I would ask one thing. I would ask that you give us the winter. Not your hand. Not yet. Only the winter. Cook in our kitchen. Sleep in your own room. Watch us with the children. Watch us with each other. By spring, if you wish to leave, I will pay your fare to anywhere on this continent. And if you wish to stay, he stopped. His voice almost steadied. Almost. If you wish to stay, then in the spring before God and a proper minister, I will marry you, and not before. Eleanor heard nothing for a moment but the blood in her own ears. A winter. He was offering her a winter, a roof and a bed of her own, and time. He was offering her the one currency she had never been given in 24 years of being a daughter and a niece and a soon-to-be broodmare for a Boston widower. He was offering her time to choose. She looked at him. She looked at the scar that ran down his cheek, and at the honey-colored eyes that did not flinch from hers, and at the way his enormous calloused hand still cradled his hat, as though the hat were a small living thing he did not want to crush. Behind him, his brother Cassius shifted his weight. His mouth was a hard line. His amber eyes were watchful, the way a wolf's eyes are watchful when its pack is being approached. The burn scar on his forearm caught the gray light. Cassius, Eleanor understood, had not yet decided whether he liked her. Cassius would need convincing. Behind him, Ezekiel stood a little easier. His mouth was a little softer. The mole below his right eye moved as he gave her a small smile, the kind of smile a man gives a woman to say, I see that you are afraid, and I do not wish to make it worse. From inside his coat, he drew of all things a small harmonica. He did not play it. He only held it in his palm as if to say, we have music in our house, even up there, even in winter. And behind them, the small, fierce girl with the cornflower eyes had hold of the hem of Eleanor's traveling dress. She was tugging it, tugging hard. You are coming, the girl said, not as a question. Eleanor looked down at her. You are coming, Adelaide repeated, fierce as ever, because Uncle Silas does not cry in front of people, but he cried after the second lady left. I heard him. I was supposed to be asleep, but I was not asleep, and I heard him in the kitchen, so you have to come, even if it is only for the winter. Because if you go away on the morning coach, he will not cry where I can hear him this time, and I will not know, but I will know, do you see? And that is worse. Mrs. Wexler, behind Eleanor, drew in a sharp breath. Mrs. Pickering muttered something about the impertinence of children. Sheriff Hollister put his hat back on his head very slowly. And Silas Hawthorne did not look at his niece. He looked instead at his own boots in the mud, and his throat worked once, and his enormous shoulders rose and fell as if a great weight had just been laid on them, and as if he had decided to carry it without complaint. Eleanor had not wept on the train when her trunk was lost. She had not wept in the alley behind her Aunt Margaret's house when she counted the $2 in her purse and understood what they meant. She had not wept at the depot in Boston. She had not wept once since her father had died. She did not weep now. But something inside her gave way the way river ice gives way in March, all at once and with a sound like a long, slow tearing. She crouched down in the mud, ruining the hem of her dress, and she looked Adelaide in the eye. What is the youngest one called? She asked the girl. The baby. 10 months, your uncle said. Whitman, Adelaide said, we call him Whit. His mama died when he came out, and his daddy went off, and he is ours now. Uncle Cass holds him most. Uncle Cass is the one with the burn. He acts mean. He is not mean. He sings to Whit at night when he thinks no one can hear him. Cassius, the brother with the burn scar, made a sound in his throat that might have been protest or might have been embarrassment. He turned his head sharply away and pretended to examine a piece of harness on his horse. And the 4-year-old Eleanor said, Jasper, Adelaide said, he is sickly. He coughs. We try not to let him get cold, but he gets cold anyway. And the big one is Tobias. Toby. He is 15. He is angry a lot, but he is not really angry. He is sad because his real father drank and his real mother went to Jesus. And now he is afraid Uncle Silas will send him away for being angry, but Uncle Silas would not. Uncle Silas would never. Eleanor heard behind her Mrs. Wexler quietly close the boarding house door from the inside. Mrs. Pickering had retreated to the church steps. The men of Iron Creek had gone back to their business, or pretended to. The sheriff stood alone on the boardwalk with his hat in his hand. Eleanor stood up. The mud had stained her hem to the knees. She did not look down at it. She looked at Silas Hawthorne. She kept her voice steady. Mr. Hawthorne, she said, I will accept your terms. The winter, a room of my own, a house full of children, 3 brothers, I will accept all of it, but I will tell you one thing in front of these witnesses, and you will agree to it, or I will turn around now and take the morning coach. Silas did not move. Yes, ma'am. If by spring I have given you a year of my labor and my care, and I find that I wish to stay, you will not marry me out of duty. You will marry me out of choice, the same choice I am making now. I will not be a contract you signed in a hard winter. Do you understand me, sir? Silas looked up. The colored eyes were very steady now. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. I have not married out of duty in my life, and I will not start with you. If by spring you wish to stay, it will be because I have asked you to properly on one knee with a ring my brother made and a vow I wrote down myself. And not before. Eleanor felt her hand shake just once, and she stilled it. Then I will come, she said. The wind shifted. The first flakes of snow, fine as ash, began to drift down through the gray sky. Adelaide made a small triumphant sound and ran back to her uncles, who were already turning their horses toward the general store at the end of the street. Cassius scooped the child up and put her on the saddle in front of him with one practiced motion, and as he did, Eleanor saw very briefly his face soften in a way she would not have believed possible from the hard, amber-eyed man of a moment ago. He kissed the top of Adelaide's head. He thought no one was looking. Eleanor was looking. Eleanor would remember. Mrs. Wexler emerged from her boarding house with a frown and a kettle and the grudging announcement that there was tea if Mrs. Whitmore wanted it while she waited. Eleanor accepted. She sat by the window of the boarding house parlor and she watched the 3 Hawthorne brothers move through Iron Creek with the unhurried efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times. She watched Silas pay the storekeeper in hard coin, counted out one piece at a time. She watched Cassius load sacks of flour and sugar and salt into the wagon bed, and she watched the muscles in his shoulders work under his coat. And she understood in a quiet way that men of this size and this skill did not exist in Boston. Boston bred a different kind of man. Boston bred Cornelius Pemberton. She watched Ezekiel, the quiet one, walk into the small post office with an envelope in his hand. She watched him pause at the door, glance once toward the boarding house window, and lift his hat to her in a small and graceful gesture before going inside. The mole below his right eye creased with a small and not quite shy smile. She watched Adelaide hold the reins of all three horses with the gravity of a small general while the men loaded the wagon. And she watched the snow begin in earnest now, fat, slow flakes falling on Iron Creek, on the mud, on the wagons, on the broad shoulders of the Hawthorne brothers, on her own hand pressed against the cold parlor glass. I will come, she had said. She had not said for how long. She had not said why. She had not said that the alternative was a man in Boston who already had 3 dead wives and was looking for a 4th. She had only said, I will come. And as she watched, she did not know, could not yet know that in Boston, Massachusetts, in a small Western Union office at the back of a grocer's shop, a clerk had 3 days earlier received a telegram from a private inquiry agent in Denver, and that the telegram had borne 3 short lines, subject located, Iron Creek, Colorado territory, awaiting instructions. She did not know that a man named Cornelius Pemberton had, on receipt of the telegram, turned to his manservant and said in a voice that had buried 3 women without breaking, "Prepare my trunk. We leave Friday for the West. The girl is mine, and I will have her back in this life or the next." But Eleanor had survived Boston. Eleanor would survive Iron Creek. Eleanor was about to climb a mountain. Outside the window, Silas Hawthorne finished loading the wagon. He glanced up at the boarding house. His honey eyes found hers through the glass. He did not smile. He only gave her a small nod, a single dip of his hat, the way a man gives a signal to another man across a crowded yard. "Ready," the nod said. "When you are." Eleanor set down her teacup. She rose. She straightened her ruined skirt. Mrs. Wexler stood in the parlor doorway with her arms folded and her mouth tight. "You sure about this, child?" the older woman asked, one last time. "No," Eleanor said. "No, I am not sure of any of it, but I have been sure of the wrong things my whole life, Mrs. Wexler, and they have brought me here, so I think I will try being unsure for a while and see where that takes me." She walked out into the snow. Cassius held the reins of the lead team. His hard mouth set, his eyes already scanning the road up the mountain for trouble. Ezekiel sat on the wagon's tailboard harmonica, back in his pocket, now ready to drop down at the first sign of a stuck wheel. Adelaide had been bundled into a nest of furs in the wagon bed and was already half asleep with her thumb in her mouth, dignity entirely abandoned the moment no one was looking. Silas stood by the wagon's high seat. He did not offer her a hand up. Eleanor understood somehow that this was respect rather than rudeness. She gathered her skirt, she put her foot on the iron step, she climbed up and settled herself on the bench next to him, and the cold of the wood went through her dress like a knife. Silas reached behind the seat. He drew out a heavy bison robe, the fur thick and dark and smelling of cedar smoke and old summers. He laid it across her lap without a word and tucked it around her ankles with hands that should have been clumsy at such a small task, and were not. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly one last time, "there is still time to climb back down." "There is not," Eleanor said, and she meant it in more ways than he could yet know. Silas Hawthorne nodded once. He clucked his tongue. The 4 big draft horses leaned into their harness, and the wagon creaked, and Iron Creek began very slowly to move past them and away. The snow thickened. The pines closed in on either side of the wagon road. The town fell behind, its lamps lit early against the gathering dark, and ahead of them the road climbed and climbed and climbed. Adelaide stirred under her furs and murmured something in her sleep. Ezekiel on the tailboard began very quietly to play his harmonica, a soft, slow tune that Eleanor did not know but would come in time to know better than her own heartbeat. Cassius rode point on his big black horse, his rifle balanced across his knees, his eyes on the timber, and beside her, Silas Hawthorne drove the team in silence, the reins easy in his huge gloved hands, the scar on his cheek catching the last gray light of the day. Eleanor pulled the bison robe tighter around herself. She closed her eyes. For the first time since her father had died, she let herself feel the full weight of how tired she was. Somewhere behind them in Iron Creek, a sheriff named Hollister was already locking up his office for the night and shaking his head over the strange, foolish bravery of a Boston girl who had said yes to a winter on the mountain. Somewhere ahead of them in the timber on a high ridge, 30 miles from any neighbor, 3 small children and a 15-year-old boy were watching the road from a cabin window, waiting to see whether their uncles would come home alone again or whether this third time, the lady from Boston would actually come. Eleanor opened her eyes. The snow was falling harder now. The world was going white. Beside her, the man with the scar held the reins of 4 big horses and the lives of 7 people, and he did not look at her, and he did not need to. She thought very clearly, I have nowhere to go but up. And she thought more quietly, but no less clearly, I am not afraid. That was the first lie she told on the mountain. It would not be the last, but it was the one that mattered because she said it to herself and she said it on purpose and she made it true by saying it. The wagon climbed, the pines closed behind them like a door, and Iron Creek, with all its mud and all its judgment and all its small, frightened decencies, dropped away below them into the dusk. What Eleanor Whitmore did not yet know was that the road she was on, the road climbing now into the timber and the snow and the failing light, was the only road she would ever travel again that mattered. Every road before this one had been the wrong one. Every road after this one would only lead her home. But she would have to earn the home first. And the earning of it, my friends, was about to begin. The road up the mountain was not a road. It was a memory of a road scratched into the side of the timber by men with axes and patience and a great deal of dynamite, and in places it disappeared entirely beneath drifts of snow that had not melted since the previous march. Eleanor Whitmore, who had spent the first hour of the climb pretending to be unafraid, and the second hour discovering that pretending and being were not in fact the same thing, found herself leaning by the third hour into the warm, solid bulk of Silas Hawthorne's left shoulder because there was nowhere else to lean and because the wagon bench was tilting in ways a wagon bench should not. Silas did not move away. He did not look at her. He only adjusted his weight slightly on the bench so that her shoulder would rest more comfortably against his, and he kept his honey-colored eyes on the team and on the trail and on the slow gathering dark. The mountain doesn't care, ma'am, he said quietly, his first words in nearly an hour. But we do. You hold on. Eleanor held on. The wagon climbed, the pines climbed with its dark green walls that closed in and opened out and closed in again. Ezekiel had stopped playing the harmonica. Cassius rode point a black silhouette against the white road ahead, his rifle still balanced across his knees, his head turning from side to side with the steady, measured watchfulness of a man who had learned in some war or some other hard place that the moment you stop watching is the moment the world remembers you. When the wagon at last lurched onto a section of frozen road that had iced over from a thaw 2 days prior, the back wheel slipped. The whole world tilted. Eleanor heard her own small sound of fear, and she felt the bison robe slide off her lap, and she felt the wagon bed begin to slide sideways toward a drop that fell away into nothing but pine tops and gray air. Silas did not panic. Silas did not even raise his voice. He simply stood up on the wagon's footboard, wrapped both reins around one enormous gloved fist, and dropped off the side of the wagon onto the snow all in one motion. He did not run. He walked. He walked to the rear of the wagon, planted his boots, set his shoulder against the wheel itself, and pushed. The wagon stopped sliding. Eleanor did not understand at first what she was seeing. A man cannot stop a loaded supply wagon on an icy slope. A man cannot anchor 4 draft horses by simply leaning. Except this man did, and the horses found their footing, and Cassius came thundering back from his point position to lay a hand on the lead horse's bridle and steady the team, and Ezekiel slid down off the tailboard with the soft, confident motion of a man who had done this exact thing on this exact stretch of road many times. Walk on, Silas said to the team, walk on. And the horses walked. When the wagon was on safe ground again, Silas climbed back up onto the bench beside her. He was breathing a little harder. There was sweat on his temples despite the cold. He took the reins from where he had tied them and did not look at her, and when he spoke, his voice was conversational as if nothing at all had happened. The boy in the back, he said, Toby, he thinks he should have come down with us instead of stayed home with the little ones. I told him no. He's 15. He's got a 15-year-old's pride. He'll be sour about it for 2 days. You'll meet him sour. Don't take it personal. I won't, Eleanor said. Her voice was thin. I had a 15-year-old's pride once, Mr. Hawthorne. That's so. He glanced at her just once. What were you sour about? My mother dying, Eleanor said. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Toby sour about the same thing he said, just so you know. The wagon climbed, the light went out of the sky in stages the way a fire goes out, a banking down to embers and then to ash. By the time they reached the high meadow where the trail leveled out and the timber thinned, full dark had come and the snow had stopped and the moon, a thin, cold paring of white, hung above the eastern peaks. And there in the moonlight, Eleanor saw Hawthorne Ridge for the first time. It was not a cabin. The word cabin was insufficient. It was a fortress of squared timber, 2 stories at the main hall and 1 story at the wings, with a covered breezeway connecting 3 smaller dwellings to the central hall, with a barn and a forge and a smokehouse and a chicken coop and a root cellar set into the hillside behind. Smoke rose from 3 chimneys in slow gray columns. Lamplight spilled from a half-dozen windows in warm gold rectangles. Somewhere a dog began to bark and then stopped on a sharp word from inside. Eleanor stared. "You built this," she said. "We built this," Silas said. "The 3 of us. 11 summers. Cass laid the forge. Zeke set the breezeway. I split most of the timber. Toby helped on the last 2 summers. Children helped how they could, for who Eleanor asked." Silas glanced at her, and for the first time since Iron Creek, she saw something in his face that was not careful and was not Wade. It was bewildered almost, as if she had asked him a question whose answer he had never spoken aloud. "For a family," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne," Eleanor said softly, "you did not yet have a family when you started this. 11 summers ago, you were still grieving the one you lost." Silas drove on for a long moment in silence. "We built it anyway, ma'am," he said. "A man builds for the family he hopes for, not just the one he had." The wagon rolled into the yard, the cabin door flew open before they had even halted, and 3 small figures spilled out onto the porch, followed by a fourth and taller figure who hung back in the doorway with the deliberate slouch of a 15-year-old boy who has decided in advance that he is not going to be impressed by anything. The smallest figure was a boy of perhaps 4 in a long woolen nightshirt that came to his ankles, with a pale, narrow face and dark circles beneath his eyes, and a wet-sounding cough that made Eleanor's trained ear tighten with concern. Jasper. The middle figure was a tall, thin man holding what could only be the baby Whitman, the infant bundled and red-faced and asleep against the man's shoulder. Cassius. He had ridden ahead in the last quarter mile and was already on the porch. The third figure was Adelaide, who had somehow climbed down off the wagon and gotten inside before anyone was watching, and who now stood at the front of the porch with her hands on her hips and a look on her face that said, "See, I told you so." And in the doorway, Tobias Hawthorne. He was tall, already taller than a boy of 15, had a right to be lean in the way of boys who have grown faster than their mothers could feed them, with hair the color of dark oak and eyes the same hard amber as Cassius's. He stood with one shoulder against the door jamb and his arms folded across his chest, and he watched the wagon come in with a face that had been carefully, deliberately emptied of all expression. Silas drew up the team. He set the brake. He did not move to help Eleanor down. "You go on, ma'am," he said quietly. "I'll see to the horses." Eleanor climbed down by herself, holding her ruined skirt. Her boots sank into snow that came over her ankles. Cassius came down off the porch in 2 long strides, the baby still on his shoulder, and he did not offer her his free hand either. But he said in a voice like rough cloth folded carefully, "This way, ma'am. The step is icy." She followed him up onto the porch. Adelaide grabbed her hand the moment she was close enough. "This is Jasper," Adelaide announced, pulling Eleanor toward the smaller boy. "Jasper, this is Mrs. Whitmore. She came from Boston. Boston is where the harbor is. Uncle Zeke showed me on the map." Jasper looked up at Eleanor with enormous dark eyes. He did not speak. He coughed instead, a rattling wet sound that turned Eleanor's blood cold, the way only the daughter of a doctor's blood can go cold at such a sound. She did not let him see her go cold. She crouched her ruined skirt, forgotten, and she put her gloved hand very lightly against his cheek. "Hello, Jasper," she said. "I am very pleased to meet you. May I come inside with you? It is cold out here for a man in his nightshirt." Jasper considered her with great seriousness. Then he reached up and took her hand in his small hot one, and he led her through the door of Hawthorne Ridge as though he were the master of the house and she his honored guest. The 15-year-old boy in the doorway did not move out of her way. Eleanor stopped Jasper's small hand still in hers and looked up at Tobias Hawthorne. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, and she gave him the same grave courtesy she would have given any grown man at her father's parlor in Boston. "I am Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. I have come to spend the winter at your family's invitation. I will not pretend I am not nervous. I am very nervous. I would be much obliged if you would step aside and let me bring your brother in out of the cold." Toby blinked. Something in his careful, empty face cracked just at the corners. He had been prepared for many things. He had not been prepared to be addressed as Mr. Hawthorne. He stepped aside without a word. Inside the cabin smelled of cedar smoke and venison stew and old leather and something else, something Eleanor could not at first place and only later understood was the smell of a house where men have lived alone for a long time and have done the best they could. There was a long plank table in the main hall, scrubbed pale by years of lye soap. There was an enormous stone hearth at the far end with a fire banked low. There were lamps and pegs on the wall, heavy with coats and rifles racked above the door, and a rocking chair pulled close to the fire with a half-finished pair of small woolen socks abandoned on its seat. The half-finished socks were Eleanor's first lesson in Hawthorne Ridge. Someone in this house, one of these enormous bearded men, had been sitting up at night in the firelight knitting woolen socks for a 4-year-old boy. Eleanor did not yet know which of them she would learn. She fed Jasper a cup of broth from the kettle on the hearth. She let Adelaide chatter at her. She watched Cassius lay the sleeping baby in a cradle by the fire and adjust the blanket with hands that were 3 times the size of the baby's whole head and unimaginably gentle. She watched Ezekiel come in from the barn, having helped Silas with the team, and stop in the doorway, snow on his shoulders, mole creased with that small, not quite shy smile. "You are still here, ma'am," Ezekiel said, soft enough that only she could hear it. "Forgive me. We made small bets in the wagon, the 3 of us, about the 2nd mile, the 5th mile, the 9th mile, about when you would ask us to turn around. I lost my bet. I am very glad I lost." Eleanor felt heat climb into her cheeks. "What did you bet?" she asked. Ezekiel's smile widened a little. "I bet on the 9th mile, ma'am. The other 2 bet earlier." She laughed before she could think to stop herself. It was the first time she had laughed in many weeks. The sound surprised her so much that it almost made her cry. Adelaide, sensing weakness, immediately climbed into her lap. That night, Eleanor was given the room that had been Mary's. Silas showed her the door himself. He did not open it. He stopped in the breezeway with a lamp in his hand, and he did not look at her. "This was my wife's," he said, "and my daughter's. They are gone these 8 years. I have not used the room since. It is yours for as long as you stay. There is a bolt on the inside of the door. You will use it. My brothers and I sleep in the wing on the far side of the breezeway. The children sleep above the main hall. You will not be disturbed at night. If you need anything, you will call out, and one of the children will fetch us. Do not come to our wing. We have agreed on this between ourselves, and we will not break the agreement. Do you understand me, ma'am?" "I understand," Eleanor said softly. Silas nodded once. He set the lamp on a small table inside the door. He stepped back. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Yes, Mr. Hawthorne. Mary's things are in the trunk at the foot of the bed. I do not ask you to keep them or to move them. I only ask if you find a small wooden doll with a painted face." He stopped. He swallowed. "That was Hannah's, my daughter's. She would have been 13 this year. If you find it, please." He could not finish. Eleanor stepped close enough to see his face in the lamplight. The scar on his cheek caught the glow. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said quietly, "I will keep her doll safe." Silas closed his eyes. He did not weep. But she saw the price of not weeping in the line of his jaw and the way his enormous hand tightened on the door frame. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "Good night." He turned and walked back across the breezeway, and she watched him go, this huge, gentle man who built fortresses for families he did not yet have. And she thought, "I came here for shelter from a Boston widower. I did not know I was coming home." She did not bolt the door that night. She did, however, find the doll. Hannah Hawthorne's wooden doll sat at the bottom of the trunk, carved by a careful father's knife. The painted face faded, but still smiling. Eleanor cradled it in her lap for a long time, sitting on the edge of the bed, and she did not weep either. She set the doll on the small bedside table where she could see it from her pillow, and she lay down at last in Mary Hawthorne's old bed, in Mary Hawthorne's old room on the high ridge, 30 miles from any neighbor, and she fell asleep almost the moment her head touched the pillow. She woke once in the night to the soft sound of a harmonica somewhere across the breezeway playing very quietly, and she understood that Ezekiel was awake and could not sleep, and that the song he was playing was Shenandoah. She had not heard Shenandoah since her father had been alive. She had not known that a frontier harmonica could sound so much like grief. She slept again. The next morning she woke to the smell of burned coffee and the sound of a baby crying. When she came into the main hall in her travel dress because she had nothing else, she found Cassius Hawthorne standing in front of the hearth holding the screaming Whitman in one arm and a tin cup in the other, and looking for the first time since Eleanor had met him like a man at the end of his rope. "He has not eaten," Cassius said the moment he saw her. "He will not take the goat's milk. He will not take the cow's milk. He is hungry. We have tried everything. The girl in the village last week said sometimes the milk needs warming with a little." He stopped. "With a little something." but she would not say what. She was a young girl. She blushed. Eleanor crossed the room. She held out her arms. "May I?" she said. Cassius hesitated only a moment, then he gave her the baby. She had not held a baby in 2 years, not since her cousin's child in Boston, but the body remembered. She tucked Whitman against her shoulder, hummed once low in her throat, and walked him slowly toward the kitchen end of the hall. She looked at the tin cup of cold milk. She looked at the kettle on the fire. She looked at the small earthenware crock on the shelf that had to be honey. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, "the girl in the village was right. It needs warming, and a half spoon of honey and a pinch of salt. The babies who cannot keep cold milk down can sometimes keep warm milk down. My father was a doctor. He wrote on the matter. Will you let me try?" Cassius did not speak. He simply nodded. She warmed the milk. She added the honey. She added the salt. She tested it on her own wrist the way her father had taught her. And she sat down in the rocking chair by the hearth. And she fed the baby Whitman from a clean cloth dipped in the warmed milk because there was no proper bottle in the house. He took it. He took the second dipping. He took the third. By the fourth, he had stopped crying. By the sixth, he had fallen asleep against her shoulder with milk on his small chin and his small hand wrapped very tightly in the lace at her cuff. When she looked up, all three Hawthorne brothers were standing in the hall watching her. Silas had come in from the barn. Cassius had not moved. Ezekiel had appeared in the breezeway doorway. They stood in a line, three identical tall men with three different scars, and they looked at her and at the sleeping infant against her shoulder, and not one of them said a word. Eleanor said very quietly, "Do not stand there gawping at me, gentlemen. Your bread will burn." They moved. That was Eleanor's first morning at Hawthorne Ridge. By that evening, she had also baked cornbread, mended a torn pocket on Jasper's nightshirt, brushed and braided Adelaide's hair into two neat plaits, rebuilt the kitchen fire so that it would draw properly, and taught Toby with great patience, and without once raising her voice, the correct way to pour boiling water onto coffee grounds so that the result was coffee and not the bitter black sludge the Hawthorne brothers had apparently been drinking for 11 years. The first night, Silas had said no obligation. By the end of the third day, every soul in that cabin understood that an obligation had begun anyway on its own without anyone's permission, the way a fire begins from a banked ember when no one is watching. The days began to take a shape. Eleanor rose early before the men to start the fire and the bread and the porridge. Cassius, who slept lightest, rose next and would stand silently at the kitchen end of the hall for several minutes with the baby on his shoulder, watching her work before bringing her water from the well or wood from the stack. He did not speak much. He nodded a great deal. Eleanor learned that this was Cassius's way. He showed care by being where care was needed exactly when it was needed and not a moment before. Ezekiel rose later, smiling with stories about whatever the morning weather was doing on the high ridge. He played his harmonica softly while she kneaded dough. He taught her on the third day the difference between the call you used for the milk cow and the call you used for the goats. Mix them up, Mrs. Whitmore, and the goats come for milking and the cow for chasing, and neither situation will end well for anyone. Silas rose, first of all the men before even Eleanor, because Silas was already gone by the time she came into the main hall. He hunted at first light and was back by mid-morning with whatever the mountain had given him. A brace of grouse one day, a young deer the next. Silas spoke perhaps 30 words to Eleanor in the first 10 days, and every single one of them mattered. He taught her in a single quiet 5-minute lesson out behind the smokehouse how to read the difference between a deer track and a wolf track in fresh snow. "Wolf track, Mrs. Whitmore, you come inside the cabin and you do not argue with me about it. Promise me that. I promise, Mr. Hawthorne." Tobias remained sour for 2 days, exactly as Silas had predicted. On the third day, Eleanor handed him a steaming cup of properly made coffee without comment, and he drank it, and he looked at her over the rim of the cup, and he said, "All right, ma'am, all right." It was the closest thing to a welcome a 15-year-old boy could give. Eleanor accepted it with a small, grave nod. By the end of the first week, she had learned the shape of all 4 children. Adelaide, who was small and fierce and read better than most grown men in Iron Creek, and who had appointed herself Eleanor's second in command. Jasper, who coughed in the night and clung to Eleanor's skirt in the day, and seemed slowly to be unfolding from a frightened small thing into a child who would smile if you smiled at him first. Whitman, who had taken to her so completely that Cassius now carried him to her every morning the way one delivers a parcel to its rightful owner. And Tobias, who was sour and proud and clever and very, very afraid, though he would have rather died than admit it. Toby was afraid that she would leave. Eleanor saw it the day she caught him watching her from the barn door, and his face went hard and shuddered the moment her eyes met his, the way a boy's face goes hard when he has been caught hoping for something and does not want to be seen hoping. By the end of the second week, she had also learned the shape of the three brothers. Silas was the steady one, the decision maker, the one who had built this place out of grief and stubbornness and the refusal to die, and who carried the weight of all of it on shoulders that did not ever slump. He spoke little and watched everything. He had loved Mary and Hannah, and he loved them still, and he did not pretend otherwise. Cassius was the wild one, the one with the burn scar wrapped around his forearm, which Eleanor learned on the 10th day had been earned during the war when a Confederate shell had set fire to a field hospital, and Cassius had carried 6 wounded men out before someone had noticed his sleeve was burning. Cassius was the middle of them by perhaps 20 minutes, the brothers all swore, and Cassius was the one who had never married, never courted, never let any woman closer than the length of a barn. Cassius, Eleanor saw, was the one who held Whitman every night by the fire and sang to him very quietly when he believed everyone was asleep, and Cassius was the one who would in the end be the hardest to convince that she was real. Ezekiel was the quiet one, the musician, the one whose fiancé had died on a stagecoach robbery 7 years earlier and who had not since then looked at any other woman the way a man looks. Ezekiel was the gentlest with Jasper, who needed gentleness most. Ezekiel was the one who on the 12th night found Eleanor weeping silently at the kitchen window after she had fed Whitman and who did not ask her why. He simply pressed a clean handkerchief into her hand and stood with her in the dark for a few minutes and then went back to bed. He had not asked her why. That was his gift. He had known. The first true crisis came on the 17th night. It came in the form of wolves. Eleanor had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day of laundering. She woke to the sound of a cow bellowing in terror, a sound that came up from the barn and through the cold air and through the timbers of the cabin, and she was on her feet and into her wrapper before she had fully understood what she was hearing. In the main hall, Silas was already pulling on his boots. Cassius had a rifle. Ezekiel was lighting a second lantern. The children were spilling down the loft ladder in their nightclothes, eyes huge. "Stay inside," Silas said in a voice that did not raise itself and did not need to. "All of you. Mrs. Whitmore, you keep them in." He went out. Cassius and Ezekiel went out after him. Eleanor herded the children into the warmest corner of the hearth. Adelaide held Jasper. Tobias stood at the window with his face pressed to the glass, his fists clenched at his sides, every line of his body, the line of a 15-year-old boy who knew he should be out there with the men and was not. Eleanor laid her hand very gently on the back of his neck. "Toby," she said, "they need you in here. Whitman is awake. Whitman is afraid. He knows your voice. Will you go to him?" Toby did not move for a long moment. Then he turned and went to the cradle and picked up the baby. And he held him with the awkward, careful grip of a boy not used to holding babies, and his shoulders very slowly came down out of his ears. Outside a rifle fired, then another, then a man shouted. Eleanor could not tell which. Then there was a long, terrible silence. She remembered very clearly Silas's words about wolf tracks. "Come inside. Do not argue." She thought of Silas outside in the dark with a wolf at his throat. She turned and crossed the hall and took down the buffalo rifle that hung above the door. It was heavier than she had expected. She had read about loading it in her father's manual on rainy afternoons in Boston when she had been 13, and her father had laughed and said, "Child, you will never need to know this, but learn it anyway. Learn everything you can. The world is wider than a parlor." She had loved her father in that moment, as in every moment, and she had learned. Adelaide stared at her with enormous eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore, I am only going to the porch, Adelaide. I will not go further. Bolt this door behind me. Do you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a blow. The night was very bright with moonlight on snow. In the yard between the cabin and the barn, she saw by that hard moonlight 4 moving shapes. 3 were men. 1 was not. The 4th shape was lean and long and gray, and it was crouched low over a black mound on the snow, and the black mound was Cassius Hawthorne, and Cassius Hawthorne was not moving. Eleanor did not think. She raised the buffalo rifle the way her father's manual had taught her. She set the butt deep into the hollow of her shoulder. She breathed in. She held it. She fired into the air just over the wolf's head because she could not risk Cassius, and she only needed the noise. The boom of the rifle cracked across the high ridge like a thunderclap. The wolf bolted. The other shape Silas had been chasing in the timber bolted with it. Then Silas was running across the snow toward Cassius, and Ezekiel was running too, and Eleanor was running in her wrapper and bare feet, the rifle still smoking in her hands, and they reached him together. Cassius was alive. He had been knocked down by a wolf that had come out of a blind angle, and his right shoulder was torn open in 3 deep furrows that were already bleeding through his coat into the snow. He was conscious. He was swearing in a low, steady voice, the like of which Eleanor had never heard in any Boston parlor and would never repeat in one. Inside, Eleanor said, "Now." They got him inside. They laid him on the long plank table. Eleanor sent Tobias for hot water. She sent Adelaide for clean cloths. She sent Ezekiel for the whiskey. She washed her hands twice. She rolled up her sleeves. She looked once at Silas, whose face was the color of ash. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, "I am the daughter of a doctor. I have read every book in his medical library. I have assisted him on 3 field surgeries during the cholera year in Boston. I can do this, but I need you to hold your brother down, and I need you to trust me. Can you trust me?" Silas looked at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She stitched Cassius Hawthorne's shoulder by lamplight, 23 stitches in 3 long furrows with whiskey for both the wound and the patient. Cassius did not cry out once, though his teeth were locked tight enough to crack. When she was done, she packed the shoulder with poultice, wrapped it clean, and gave him a 3rd measure of whiskey and a soft order to sleep. He looked up at her with hard amber eyes that were for the first time not wary at all. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said hoarsely. "Yes, Mr. Hawthorne. You shoot a buffalo rifle awful well for a Boston girl." Eleanor laughed a small broken laugh, and she had to put her hands flat on the table to keep them from shaking. "My father," she said. "He believed a woman should know everything a man knows. He used to say the world is wider than a parlor, Mr. Hawthorne. I think perhaps he was right." Cassius closed his eyes. A small, unmistakable smile pulled at the corner of his hard mouth. "Sister," he said quietly, "welcome home." Eleanor stopped breathing for a moment. It was the first time any of them had used the word. She did not look at Silas. She was afraid, suddenly and absurdly, that if she looked at Silas, she would weep in front of all of them. And she did not weep in front of others, not since the day her father was buried, and she would not start tonight. Silas behind her said nothing, but she felt him step closer. She felt the warmth of his coat at her back. She felt his enormous hand come to rest very briefly and very lightly between her shoulder blades. He did not press. He did not linger. He simply rested his hand there for the space of one breath, and then he took it away, and he said in his quiet rock voice, "You saved my brother's life, Mrs. Whitmore. I will not forget that." Eleanor closed her eyes. "I will not forget it either," she said, and she did not say what she meant, which was, "I will not forget that you touched me very gently between the shoulder blades in front of God and your brothers, and I will not forget the shape of that touch as long as I live." Outside, the wolves howled once more, far off in the timber, and were gone. Inside, Hawthorne Ridge banked its fire low and slept. The next morning, Eleanor woke before dawn, as always, and went to the kitchen end of the hall to start the fire and the bread. The hall was dark. The hearth was banked to embers. The children were still asleep in the loft above. She thought she was alone. She was not alone. Silas was sitting in the rocking chair by the hearth. He had not gone to bed. He had a tin cup of cold coffee in his hand that he had clearly not been drinking, and he was looking into the embers, and he did not look up when she came in. She did not speak. She built the fire back up. She put the kettle on. She set the dough she had laid the night before to its second rise. She moved around him as one moves around a sleeping animal with a careful courtesy. When the kettle began to sing, he finally raised his head. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne, I have been sitting here since you stitched my brother, I know," she said softly. "I have been thinking about what I said in Iron Creek. About the winter," she said, "about the spring." "Yes, ma'am." He set the cold coffee on the hearthstones. He stood. He was very tall in the firelight, and the scar on his cheek was a pale line, and his honey-colored eyes were not careful now. They were not weighed. They were only tired and direct and very honest. "I will keep the agreement," he said. "The room is yours. The bolt is yours. The winter is yours. I will not press you. I will not court you. I will not crowd you. My brothers will not crowd you. By spring, if you wish to go, I will pay your fare as promised, and I will not say one word of complaint." Eleanor waited. But Silas said, he stopped. He looked at his own enormous hands. He looked back at her. "But last night, when I heard that rifle fire from the porch, and I knew it was you, and I knew you had come out into the cold for my brother, and you had risked your life, and you were standing there in your wrapper with snow on your bare feet." He paused. His voice did not break, but it thinned. He paused. "Mrs. Whitmore, last night, I knew. I knew, ma'am. And I have been sitting here all night trying to find a way to tell you that does not break our agreement." Eleanor's hands were trembling. She set the kettle down so that she would not drop it. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said quietly, "what did you know?" Silas drew a long breath. I knew that I do not want you to leave in the spring, he said. That is what I knew. I will not press the point. I will keep my word. The winter is yours and the choice is yours. But I would be a liar before God if I did not say it once plainly where you could hear it. I do not want you to leave in the spring, ma'am. That is the truth of it. That is all I have to say. The fire popped, the kettle hissed. Outside, very far off, a single crow called once across the white meadow and was answered by another. Eleanor crossed the small distance between them. She did not touch him. She stopped close enough that he could have touched her if he had broken his agreement, which he did not, because he was Silas Hawthorne and his word was his word. Mr. Hawthorne, she said, her voice was steady, I will tell you something in return. I will not tell you yet whether I am staying. That is the agreement, and I will keep it as you have kept it. But I will tell you this. Last night when I came into this hall with that rifle in my hands, I was not afraid. I have been afraid every day of my life since my father died. I was not afraid last night. Do you understand me? Silas looked at her. He understood her. I understand, ma'am, he said. Then we will let the winter pass, Eleanor said, and we will see what we see when the snow goes off. We will let the winter pass. Silas agreed. He picked up his cold coffee. He poured it back into the kettle to warm. He did not look at her again, but the line of his shoulders had eased, and the tiredness was a different tiredness now, and Eleanor thought, watching him in the firelight, that perhaps she had not yet decided to stay, but she had stopped somewhere in the night deciding to leave. What she did not yet know, what neither of them yet knew, was that 3 days earlier, far below in Iron Creek, a stagecoach had pulled up in front of Mrs. Wexler's boarding house, and that a man named Cornelius Pemberton had stepped down out of it in a heavy black coat and a fur-lined hat, carrying a leather portfolio thick with sealed documents. He had been there 3 days now, drinking the sheriff's coffee, showing his documents, taking the measure of the county, and he was on this very morning asking the sheriff a single quiet question. Where Mr. Pemberton was asking in this town, can a man find a federal judge? Sheriff Hollister, who was 64 years old and had buried 2 wives and feared nothing on God's earth except injustice done to a young woman by an old rich man, looked at Cornelius Pemberton for a long moment, and he said, Mister, you'd best come inside out of the cold and sit with me a spell, because I think you are about to do something, and I think before you do it, you and I are going to have a conversation. Up on the ridge, Eleanor poured fresh hot coffee into Silas Hawthorne's tin cup. The winter was not in fact theirs to keep undisturbed, but for one more morning in a cabin that smelled of cedar smoke and rising bread and the iron tang of last night's whiskey on a healing wound, the winter was still theirs. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had come up the mountain with $2 in a brooch, and the conviction that she was making the last bad choice of a life full of bad choices, set the coffee in front of the man who had just told her he did not want her to leave, and she said very softly, Mr. Hawthorne, your brother will need broth before noon. I will see to it. Silas looked up at her. Yes, ma'am, he said. Outside, the sun rose at last over Hawthorne Ridge, white and cold and clean, and somewhere in the distance, Sheriff Hollister was already saddling a chestnut mare for a hard ride up a hard mountain, carrying the warning of a man who had come to take her back. But that, my friends, is a fight for tomorrow. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a horse. It was a chestnut mare lathered to a foam despite the cold, and the rider on her back was Sheriff Hollister himself, 64 years old, and not a man who climbed mountains for amusement. He came up the last switchback at a gait somewhere between a trot and a prayer, and when he reached the level of the yard, he half slid, half dismounted, and he did not even bother to tie the mare. He left her standing, breath steaming in great white clouds, and he came up the porch steps 2 at a time. It was the morning of Eleanor's 24th day at Hawthorne Ridge. She had been at the kitchen end of the hall, kneading the day's bread with Whitman in a sling at her hip, the way Cassius had shown her on the day his shoulder began to itch beneath its bandage, which was a sign her father's manual had said that flesh was knitting back to flesh. Cassius was already up and moving slowly, and he had taken to following Eleanor about the cabin during his recovery the way a tall and silent shadow follows a small bright lamp. He was sitting at the long table now, mending a bridle one-handed, and he was the first to hear the horse. He set down the bridle, he stood, he crossed to the window, his amber eyes narrowed. Silas, he said, his voice was quiet, trouble is coming up. Silas was in the dooryard splitting kindling. He came up onto the porch with his axe still in his hand, and he set it carefully against the wall before he opened the door to Sheriff Hollister, because Silas Hawthorne did not ever greet a man with an axe in his hand. If he could help it, the sheriff did not waste words. Silas, he said. Mrs. Whitmore, I rode up here ahead of trouble, and I rode hard. There is a man come up from Boston 3 days ago. He stepped off the coach. He has been drinking my coffee and showing me documents and taking the measure of this county for 3 days. His name is Cornelius Pemberton. He has hired a federal judge, a man named Crowley out of Denver, and 4 armed deputies, and he is on the road behind me now. He carries a writ of guardianship that he claims gives him legal hold of Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore until her 25th year. He intends, ma'am, to take you back to Boston. Eleanor felt the bread dough go cold under her hands. She looked at Silas. Silas had gone very still, in the way a man goes still who has spent his life learning when to move and when not to. He looked at the sheriff, then he looked at Eleanor, then he looked at his brothers. Cassius had come to the kitchen end of the hall, and Ezekiel had come down from the loft where he had been mending a leak in the roof. And the 3 of them stood in a triangle around her, 3 men of one face, and not one of them said a word. Silas spoke first. How far behind you, Sheriff? 3 hours, Hollister said. Maybe less. They moved slow because of the snow on the lower bend, but they were moving when I left. You came up here at risk to yourself, Silas said. I will not forget it. I am 64 years old, Silas. The sheriff's voice was tired. I have buried 2 wives and 3 friends. I have run this county 12 years. I know an old rich man come west to fetch a young woman against her will when I see one. And I have eaten Mrs. Whitmore's bread, sir, and I have seen what kind of woman she is, and I will tell you plainly, I do not work for Cornelius Pemberton. I work for the people of this county, and Mrs. Whitmore, the moment she stepped off that train, became one of mine. So I came up here to tell you what is coming and to tell you what your options are. Silas nodded once. What are they? Hollister blew out a long breath. The writ is real, he said. Crowley is a real federal judge, though he is not an honest one, and Pemberton has paid him in good coin. As long as Mrs. Whitmore is unmarried, the writ has the force of federal law in this territory. I cannot stop them taking her. If you stand in their way, sir, you will be arrested for obstruction of a federal officer, and your brothers with you, and I will not be able to protect you. Pemberton has been very careful with his paper. Eleanor heard her own breath come quick and shallow. The bread dough was forgotten. Whitman, sensing her tension, made a small sound of protest at her hip, and Cassius crossed the room in 2 strides and lifted the baby out of her sling with his good arm and settled him against his bandaged shoulder without a flinch. Easy, Sister Cassius said quietly. Easy. We are not done yet. Silas was still looking at the sheriff. You said options, he said. That was one. What are the others? Hollister held his eye for a long moment. The writ holds against an unmarried woman, Silas. It does not hold against a married one. Colorado territory is very clear on the matter. A woman who has reached her 21st year and entered into a lawful marriage of her own free will cannot be claimed under a prior guardianship writ. Her husband is her guardian in the eyes of the law. There is no judge in this nation, federal or otherwise, who would overturn that, and Crowley knows it and Pemberton knows it. That is why they are moving fast. They want her under that writ before any vow is spoken. The hall was very quiet. Eleanor felt every one of her own heartbeats very distinct, one after the other. Silas turned slowly and looked at her. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice was rough. I gave you my word. The winter was yours, the spring was yours. I have not pressed you, and I will not press you now. You hear me when I say this. If you wish to go back to Boston, I will fight beside the sheriff to make Pemberton do it lawfully and with dignity. If you wish to take the morning coach to anywhere else on this continent, I will pay the fare, and I will not say a word against it. And if you wish, he stopped. He could not say it. Cassius said it for him. If you wish to be Mrs. Hawthorne by sundown, sister, the wild brother said very quietly, just say so, and we will send for the parson, and the 3 of us will hold this ridge against any federal judge in this nation until the vow is spoken. Ezekiel did not speak. He did not need to. His mole-creased mouth was set in a hard, small line that Eleanor had not seen before, and his hand had already gone to the rifle on the rack above the door, and he was checking the load with the calm, sure motion of a man who had been a soldier once and remembered. Eleanor looked from one brother to the next. 3 identical men, 3 different ways of saying the same thing, 3 different scars. She thought in a single clear instant of the night Silas had told her in the firelight that he did not want her to leave in the spring. She thought of the morning Cassius had called her sister with his shoulder in 23 stitches and his voice rough with whiskey and pain. She thought of Ezekiel pressing a clean handkerchief into her hand at the kitchen window in the dark, and of the harmonica playing Shenandoah at midnight across the breezeway, and of the small wooden doll on her bedside table, and of the bolt on the inside of her door that she had not used in 17 nights. She thought of Cornelius Pemberton and of the 3rd wife he had buried, the one with the broken neck. She set her flour-dusted hands flat on the kitchen table to steady herself. Sheriff Hollister, she said. Her voice was clear. Will you stand witness? Hollister removed his hat. Mrs. Whitmore, he said gravely, it would be the honor of my life. She turned to Silas. Mr. Hawthorne. Yes, ma'am. You once told me that if I wished to stay in the spring, you would ask me properly, on one knee, with a ring your brother made and a vow you wrote down yourself. Silas swallowed. His honey-colored eyes did not leave hers. Yes, ma'am, I did say that. I am asking you, Sir Eleanor said quietly, to ask me a season early. The fire in the hearth popped once. Outside, far below, on the mountain road, an unseen stagecoach creaked nearer through the timber, and in the great hall of Hawthorne Ridge, in front of the sheriff and two brothers and a baby on a wounded man's shoulder, Silas Hawthorne walked across the kitchen to the woman from Boston with the flower on her hands, and he lowered himself very slowly onto one knee on the worn plank floor. He took from the inside pocket of his shirt, where it had been waiting against his heart for a length of time. Eleanor would never have the courage to ask about a small folded paper. He took from the same pocket a ring. It was not a fine ring. It was made of cold rolled iron, hammered thin, and twisted into a band, and set into the band was a single small piece of mountain turquoise, the color of a high lake at dawn. Cassius had made it. Cassius made it 3 days after she stitched his shoulder, working in his forge in the long hours of the night when he could not sleep. He had not told Silas. Silas had not asked. Cassius had simply pressed it into Silas's palm one morning at breakfast with a single nod, and Silas had carried it against his heart ever since, waiting for spring. Spring had come early, Mrs. Whitmore Silas said. His voice was the voice of a man who had built fortresses out of grief and had not until this morning known what he was building them for. I am not a man of fine words. My brother Ezekiel writes prettier. My brother Cassius shouts louder. I am the one in the middle, ma'am, and I have always been quiet, and I have always been slow, and I have always been a little late to the things that mattered. I was late to my Mary. I was late to my Hannah. I have spent 8 years being late to everything that ever mattered to me. He drew a breath. He unfolded the paper. But I was not late to you, ma'am. I was not late. I was waiting. I did not know I was waiting until you stepped off that train at Iron Creek with $2 in your hand and your hem in the mud and your chin up like a little flag of a country I had never heard of and have wanted ever since to be a citizen of. Eleanor's eyes were wet. She did not move. I will read this once, Silas said, and then I will burn it, because a man should not need a paper to remember his own vow. He read, I, Silas Hawthorne, take you, Eleanor Whitmore, before God and before these witnesses. I take your hand and your name and your future, and I take with you. He paused. His huge calloused finger moved down the page. I take with you Tobias Hawthorne, your son of 15 years, who is angry because he has not yet been loved enough, and whom we will love until the anger goes. I take with you Adelaide Hawthorne, your daughter of 7 years, who is louder than any of us and braver than all of us. I take with you Jasper Hawthorne, your son of 4 years, who is small and sickly and beloved. And I take with you Whitman Hawthorne, your son of 10 months, who came to us motherless and will not by God be motherless again. Eleanor was weeping now. She wept openly and silently, and she did not lift her hand to her face, because if she lifted her hand, she would have to take it from where it rested on the kitchen table, and somehow taking it from the table felt like it would break the moment, and she would not break the moment, not for anything in this world. Silas kept reading very steadily. I promise to feed them. I promise to clothe them. I promise to teach them what little I know and to find better teachers for what I do not. I promise to love them as my own, because the 4 of them are my own already, and you are the one who has come at last to make us what we have been pretending to be these last 3 years, which is a family. He looked up at her. I told you in Iron Creek that I wanted all of you. I said it in front of half the town. I meant it then, and I mean it now. I want all of you, Eleanor Whitmore. The whole and the broken and the brave and the frightened, the Boston of you and the mountain of you and every part in between. I want every winter you have left and every spring you have left and every summer and every fall. And when the last of them is spent, I want to be buried beside you under a Colorado pine with our names on the same stone and a long dash between them that means we lived, ma'am, and that we lived together. He stopped. He folded the paper. He held up the iron and turquoise ring in his huge fingers. Eleanor Whitmore, he said, will you marry me today? Before this man rides up the mountain. Will you, ma'am? Eleanor did not speak at first. She could not. Her throat had closed. She nodded once. Then she reached out her flour-dusted left hand, and Silas Hawthorne slid the iron ring with the high lake stone onto her finger, and behind her Cassius made a low, rough sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, and Ezekiel was already moving toward the door. I will go, Ezekiel said quietly. The old trapper's trail will save us 6 miles. I can have Reverend Ainsworth on this porch in 3 hours if the snow holds. I have done it before in worse weather. Take my horse, Hollister said. He is fresher than yours. Take my coat, Cassius said. It is heavier. Take Whitman's blessing, Adelaide announced, having appeared at the foot of the loft ladder in her nightshirt, because nothing in this house had ever not once escaped her notice. She marched across the hall with great dignity, kissed her Uncle Ezekiel on the chin, and added, You bring the parson back, Uncle Zeke. You bring him back fast. Ezekiel kissed the top of her head and was gone. The next 2 hours moved with the strange double speed of a dream. Eleanor washed her hands, she washed her face, she let Adelaide brush out her honey-colored hair and pin it up in a way the little girl declared was bridal. She put on her one good dress, the navy blue traveling dress, the same dress she had stepped off the train in 24 days earlier, and she pinned the cameo brooch at her throat. Her mother had worn this brooch to her own wedding. Her mother had worn this dress shape to hers. Eleanor had not worn either to anything until today. She thought of her father. She thought he would have liked this man. He would have liked all three of these men. He would have stood at the back of this hall in his old gray coat, and he would have nodded once slowly, and he would have said, "Daughter, you have done well." Tobias appeared at her bedroom door in the only clean white shirt he owned. The boy who had been sour for 2 days when she arrived, who had been afraid all this time that she would leave, stood now in the doorway with red eyes and a stiff jaw, and he said, "Ma'am, may I walk you down? May I be the one to walk you down to him? I have not got a father living. He will not mind." Eleanor went to him. She took his face in both her hands. "Tobias," she said softly, "you will walk me down. There is no other man on this earth I would rather have walked me down. And after today, you will not call me ma'am any longer. Do you understand me?" Toby's mouth trembled. "What will I call you?" "Whatever you can stand to call me," Eleanor said. "Take your time. There is no hurry." He nodded once. He could not speak. He offered her his arm. She took it. Reverend Ainsworth arrived on Hollister's chestnut mare at the head of a trail Eleanor had not known existed, with snow in his white beard and his prayer book wrapped in oilcloth against his chest. He was 70 years old, and his fingers were stiff with cold, and he had to be helped up the porch stairs. But his voice, when he stood by the great hearth with the prayer book open, was the voice of a man who had been marrying frontier couples for 40 years and who had buried half of them himself and who knew in his bones that this one was good. The wedding was small. It was the smallest wedding any of them would ever attend. Tobias walked Eleanor the length of the hall from the breezeway door to the hearth, while Adelaide preceded them with a fistful of dried winter berries because there were no flowers. Jasper held Whitman very seriously, sitting cross-legged on the rug. Cassius stood at Silas's right shoulder as best man. Ezekiel stood at Silas's left, still in his snow-crusted coat harmonica in his pocket, having ridden 18 miles in 3 hours and not yet sat down. Sheriff Hollister stood as legal witness with his hat off and his hand on his heart. The Reverend spoke the old words. Silas spoke his vow, the one he had read aloud once already and had then folded back into his pocket because a man should not need a paper, and he spoke it now without the paper, exactly the same. Eleanor spoke hers. She had not written one. She did not need one. She said, Eleanor Whitmore, take you, Silas Hawthorne. I take your hand and your name and your 4 children and your 2 brothers and your mountain and your fortress and your scar. I take all of you. I have wanted all of you since the morning I held your youngest at the hearth, and you stood in this hall and did not have words. I have words enough for both of us, Mr. Hawthorne. I will use them carefully. I will use them for you. The Reverend Ainsworth pronounced them man and wife. Silas leaned down. He kissed her very lightly with a courtesy that startled her into stillness on the corner of her mouth. His beard was rough. His mouth was warm. The whole kiss took perhaps 2 seconds, and Eleanor would remember it her whole life. Adelaide cheered. Jasper coughed. Whitman, for reasons known only to babies, began to laugh. Cassius signed the register with his good hand, his mouth in a hard line that was on closer inspection the line of a man trying not to grin. Ezekiel signed after him. Hollister signed after them both. Reverend Ainsworth pressed the seal of the territory into hot wax and pressed the wax onto the page, and the marriage of Silas Hawthorne and Eleanor Whitmore was in the eyes of God and the eyes of Colorado territory complete. It was complete by perhaps 15 minutes. The federal procession came up the last bend of the road into the dooryard at noon. Cornelius Pemberton stepped down from the lead sleigh first. He was 60 years old. He was perhaps 5 feet 8 inches in tall boots. He wore a black coat with a fur collar that had cost more than the entire Hawthorne barn, and he carried his leather portfolio under his arm with the easy confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime arriving in places with documents and leaving with what he had come for. Behind him came Judge Crowley in a black coat of his own with a face like a ledger and eyes that did not ever settle. Behind them came 4 armed deputies. Silas Hawthorne stepped out onto the porch of his fortress. He was wearing his only clean white shirt. His honey-colored eyes were calm. He had a wedding band of plain cold iron on his right hand made by his brother that morning to match the one on his wife's left hand, and he had no rifle because Eleanor had asked him not to carry one, and he had agreed. Cassius and Ezekiel came out to flank him. They did carry rifles. Eleanor had not asked them. "Mr. Pemberton," Silas said, his voice carried easily across the cold air. "State your business, sir, on my land." Pemberton smiled. It was a small, thin smile. It did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said, "I am here on the authority of a federal writ of guardianship signed by Judge Crowley standing at my shoulder and concerning the person of Miss Eleanor Whitmore, who is bound by prior contract to my household until her 25th year. I am informed by your sheriff that she is residing here. I will trouble you only briefly. I require her to be produced. I require her trunk to be loaded into my sleigh. I require a signed acknowledgement from you that you have not in any way interfered with the lawful execution of the writ. Once these things are done, I will be on my way." Silas did not speak. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch beside him. She had taken his arm. The iron ring with the high lake turquoise was on the third finger of her left hand in plain view, catching the cold mountain light. "Mr. Pemberton," she said. Pemberton's eyes flicked to her, then to her hand, then back to her face. Something in his face changed. "Mr. Pemberton," Eleanor said again, "there is no Miss Eleanor Whitmore on this porch. There is Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne. I was married, sir, in the great hall of this house at 15 minutes past 11 this morning by the Reverend Mr. Ainsworth of the Iron Creek Methodist Church in the presence of the sheriff of this county. The signed register is on the table behind me. Judge Crowley may inspect it at his leisure. The yard was very quiet." Pemberton's smile thinned to almost nothing. "Crowley." The judge stepped forward. He held out his gloved hand for the register. Hollister, who had come out onto the porch behind Eleanor, brought it to him. Crowley read it. He read it twice. He closed it. He looked at Pemberton. "Cornelius," he said quietly, "the marriage is in order. The writ is void. Colorado territory is very clear. I will not stake my bench on a contest I cannot win." Pemberton did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. Eleanor knew the worst thing about him. The first wife, the second wife, the third wife at the bottom of the stairs. He had not raised his voice once. He simply very smoothly drew a small Derringer pistol from the inside pocket of his coat. He pointed it at Eleanor. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said calmly, "step down off that porch. We are going home." Three things happened at once. Cassius Hawthorne moved. He moved with all the speed of a man who had been a soldier in his youth and a frontiersman in his manhood, and who had spent the past week healing from a wolf attack, and who in this moment did not feel his shoulder at all. He stepped between Eleanor and the gun. He did not shoot Pemberton. He did not shout. He simply put his own body, all 6 feet 4 inches of it, in the path of the bullet. Ezekiel Hawthorne fired once, cleanly, from the hip. A trick shot he had learned in the war, which Eleanor would later discover had been called the sharpshooter's apology because it said sorry and meant it. The bullet took Pemberton through the back of his right hand, and the Derringer flew into the snow. And Silas Hawthorne did not move at all. He stood beside his wife on the porch of the house he had built, and he watched his brother step into a bullet for her, and he watched his other brother end the bullet's flight before it ever reached its target, and he thought very clearly, "My brothers are with me." Pemberton screamed. It was a small, thin, breathless scream. Not the scream of a strong man, the scream of a man who had never in 60 years been on the receiving end of consequence. Crowley closed his eyes. Judge Hollister said very quietly, "I would like to formally request your assistance, sir, as a federal judge, in the matter of charging Mr. Cornelius Pemberton with attempted murder of a citizen of this territory before 3 witnesses, including yourself." Crowley opened his eyes. He looked at Pemberton on his knees in the bloody snow, cradling his ruined hand. He looked at Eleanor on the porch with the iron ring on her hand. He looked at the 4 deputies who were standing very still because none of them were paid enough to fire a rifle on a sitting federal judge's order at a man who had just shot at a married woman in front of said judge. Sheriff Crowley said tiredly, "I will assist you, sir." "With pleasure. Please convey the prisoner to your jail. I will drop the charges myself this evening at Mrs. Wexler's. I find I no longer require Mr. Pemberton's retainer." The deputies put Pemberton in irons. It was over in 12 minutes from start to finish. Eleanor sat down very abruptly on the porch step. Cassius, his shoulder reopened beneath his bandage from the sudden movement, sat down next to her. Silas crouched on her other side. Ezekiel laid his rifle very gently against the porch rail and sat on the step below them. 3 brothers, 1 bride, a porch, a great deal of blood and a great deal of cold and a great deal of noise dying away into the high air of a Colorado morning. Silas put his hand over Eleanor's. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said quietly. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said. "You held up real good, ma'am." "I am going to faint in about 8 seconds, Eleanor said pleasantly, "but I wanted to thank you first." Cassius laughed. It came out of him in a single cracked sound, and once it was out, he could not stop. He laughed until his shoulder hurt enough to make him stop, and then he leaned his head back against the porch post and closed his eyes, and he said hoarsely, "Sister, I am glad you did not faint before the I do, so am I," Eleanor said, and then she did in fact faint very gracefully into Silas Hawthorne's enormous arms. He carried her inside. He laid her on the long plank table where she had stitched his brother's shoulder. Adelaide brought a cool cloth. Jasper brought his own small woolen blanket because he had decided on the spot that this was what a small boy did for his mother when she fainted. Whitman patted her face with one starfish hand and said something that sounded almost like Ma. Eleanor opened her eyes. She looked up at the rough beam ceiling of Hawthorne Ridge. She felt the iron ring on her finger. She felt a small starfish hand on her cheek and a damp cloth on her forehead and the warm, hard hands of Silas Hawthorne folded around hers. She thought very clearly, "I'm married." She thought more clearly still, "I am home." But there was even now one small thing she did not know. She did not know that far down the trail, perhaps a quarter mile below the bend where Pemberton's sleighs had come up, a 15-year-old boy with hair the color of dark oak had slipped out of the back of the cabin 20 minutes after his mother had said her vow. He had taken a horse. He had not told anyone. He had heard that very morning while saddling for his uncle's hurried errand, the sheriff speak of the federal procession coming up the trail behind him. He had decided with all the wounded and stubborn pride of a boy who had been afraid of being sent away his whole short life that he was going to do something. He was not going to be the boy in the loft this time. He was going to be the man in the saddle. Tobias Hawthorne had ridden down the mountain with his uncle's other rifle across his knees. He had meant to lay an ambush at the lower bend. He had not told anyone because he knew they would have stopped him. He had, in his 15-year-old wisdom, thought that he would surprise the deputies and slow them down and that this would help. By the time he had reached the lower bend, the procession had already passed him. By the time he had turned his horse around to follow it, the procession was already 3 switchbacks above him on the road beyond his ability to catch. Tobias had stopped his horse on the lower bend. He had sat very still in the saddle. He had understood all at once that his attempt at being a man had been useless, that he had ridden out for nothing, that his mother, his new mother, the woman who had walked down a hall on his arm only that morning, was at this moment alone on a porch with a federal judge and a man with a writ, and he, Tobias Hawthorne, had not been there to stand between them. And then on the lower bend, in the cold and the snow and the failing wind, Tobias Hawthorne had done something he had not done since the day his real mother had died. He had wept. He had wept sitting on a horse in the middle of an empty mountain road with a rifle across his knees and the federal procession out of his reach above him, and he had thought, "I have failed her, I have failed her, I have failed her." He had turned his horse for home. He had ridden back slowly because there was no longer any reason to ride fast. He arrived at Hawthorne Ridge an hour after Eleanor had fainted. He came up the porch step expecting to find his uncles arrested, his mother gone, the cabin emptied. He came up expecting the worst of all possible afternoons. He had practiced on the slow ride back what he would say when he saw his Uncle Silas. He had practiced begging forgiveness. He had practiced offering to leave. He had decided on the slow ride back that he was not worthy to live in this house. He pushed open the door of the great hall. Inside, he found his mother sitting at the long plank table with a cup of tea in her hand and a cool cloth on her forehead. He found his Uncle Silas sitting beside her, holding her other hand. He found his Uncle Cassius with his shoulder freshly rebandaged and a small, pleased smile on his face. He found his Uncle Ezekiel playing a slow, soft tune on the harmonica by the hearth. He found Adelaide and Jasper and Whitman piled in a heap on the rug like a litter of sleeping puppies. He found Sheriff Hollister and Reverend Ainsworth at the kitchen end of the hall, eating bread and venison stew with the wedding register open between them and a small jar of sealing wax cooling on the table. He found, in short, a wedding that had already happened and a siege that had already ended and a family that had already chosen its new shape, all in the time it had taken him to ride down the mountain and back on his foolish errand. He stood in the doorway. He could not move. Eleanor saw him. She set down her tea. "Tobias," she said quietly, "come here, son." He could not move. She stood up from the table. She crossed the hall in the navy blue dress that had been her mother's idea of a wedding dress, and she stopped in front of her tall, stiff, frightened 15-year-old boy, and she took his face in both her hands the way she had earlier that morning. "Toby," she said, "you went after them." "I went," he said. "I tried. I was too late. I am sorry, ma'am, I am sorry." "You went," she said again. That is what I will remember, Tobias Hawthorne, not whether you arrived on time, that you went. He broke. He was a 15-year-old boy, and he had been brave and useless, and he had ridden through the cold for nothing, and he broke against her shoulder the way only a boy his age can break all at once and without apology. And Eleanor held him while he wept, and she said over and over very softly into his hair, "You are mine, Toby. You are mine. You are mine. You went and you came back and you are mine." Across the hall, Silas Hawthorne watched his wife hold his oldest boy, and he did not move from his chair because there are some moments a husband does not interrupt. Cassius Hawthorne watched his shoulder bleed slightly through fresh white linen, and he thought, "I am going to spoil that boy something awful from this day forward, and I am going to teach him to shoe a horse, and I am going to teach him to forge a hinge, and I am going to teach him there is nothing he can do that will get him sent away from this house." Ezekiel Hawthorne played very softly a slow old tune that none of them recognized because he was making it up as he played, and the tune was the tune of a family arriving at last at the shape it had been trying to be for 3 long years. Outside, the deputies finished loading Cornelius Pemberton into the sleigh, his ruined hand wrapped in a blood-soaked rag, his face the color of old paper. Judge Crowley climbed in beside him without a word. Sheriff Hollister, who had eaten 3 helpings of stew and 1 of bread, and who had pronounced both excellent, came out, at last settled his hat onto his head and looked back at the porch. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. Eleanor, still holding her oldest boy, looked up. "Sheriff." "Welcome to the territory, ma'am." "Thank you, Sheriff," Eleanor said. I think I will stay." Hollister tipped his hat. He mounted his chestnut mare. He led the procession down off the ridge with Pemberton and Irons in the second sleigh, and he did not look back. Eleanor, in the doorway of the great hall, the iron ring catching the late afternoon light, watched the federal sleighs disappear around the lower bend. That night, the door of the small bedroom that had been Mary's closed softly behind Silas and Eleanor Hawthorne. The lamp burned low for a little while, and then it burned lower, and at last it was put out. The fire on the great hearth in the main hall burned itself down to embers. Cassius slept in the rocking chair with Whitman against his shoulder because Whitman had decided on the day of his mother's wedding that he would not be put down. Ezekiel slept on the rug in front of the fire, harmonica still in his pocket. The children slept in the loft, 4 small breathing shapes under heavy quilts. And outside, across the high white meadow, the Colorado night closed over Hawthorne Ridge like a hand closing around a candle flame to keep it from going out. When morning came, everything had changed between Silas and Eleanor Hawthorne, and nothing at all. The first thaw came 6 weeks later. It came on a morning in late March with the smell of running water in the air and the first black branches of the high pines showing through where the wind had stripped the snow. Eleanor went to the porch in her wrapper and stood barefoot on the warm wood, and she breathed in and she smelled for the first time what spring smelled like on a Colorado mountain. It smelled of pine resin and snow melt and earth that had been waiting a long time to wake up. She put both her hands flat on her belly. She had known for 2 weeks. She had not yet told anyone. Behind her, the door opened. Silas stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in each hand. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He looked at his wife in her wrapper with her hands on her belly, and then he looked at her face, and then he set both cups of coffee very carefully on the porch rail, and he came and put his arms around her from behind, and he laid one enormous hand over both of hers, and he laid his face against the side of her hair. "How long?" he said very quietly. 2 weeks, she said. "Maybe 3. Are you sure?" "I am sure." Silas did not speak for a long time. Eleanor," he said at last. "Yes, I am afraid." "I know," she said. "I am afraid too." "We will be afraid together," he said. "We will," she agreed. She did not have to ask him what he was afraid of. She knew. She had not forgotten Mary. She had not forgotten Hannah. She had not forgotten the 8 years of silence in this house. She had not forgotten the doll on the bedside table. But she had also not forgotten her own mother, who had died bringing Eleanor's brother into the world. She had not forgotten the way her father in his last years had spoken of a woman's body in childbirth as a country no man has ever truly visited. She had not forgotten that she was the daughter of a doctor and that she had read every page of his medical library and that she knew better than most women on the frontier what could go wrong and what could go right and how to tell the difference. She turned in her husband's arms, she put her hands on his face, she kissed him very lightly on the mouth, and she said, "Silas Hawthorne, I am not Mary, and this is not 1871, and we will get through this together. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. He was crying very quietly, and he did not bother to hide it. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." She told the brothers that evening. Cassius dropped a tin plate. Ezekiel sat down very suddenly on the long bench. Adelaide, who had been listening from the loft, because Adelaide always listened from the loft, came down the ladder backward in her nightshirt and announced that the baby would be a girl and that her name was going to be Mary because that was only proper. And Eleanor looked at Silas and Silas looked at Eleanor, and neither of them argued with her. The baby came in late November, 9 months after the thaw, in a winter storm that pinned the cabin shut for 2 days. Old Marta Lindquist, who was the closest thing to a midwife in 300 miles, and who had come up the mountain on Cassius's wagon 4 days before the storm because Eleanor had insisted, sat with her through the long labor. Silas held her hand. Cassius paced in the kitchen and split enough kindling for a year. Ezekiel played the harmonica very quietly in the breezeway because he could not stand to do nothing. Tobias kept the children fed and the fire stoked, and his face very calm because he was 16 now and he was the man of the house when the men of the house were busy. The baby was a girl. She came into the world with a strong cry and a head full of dark hair and eyes that would in a few weeks settle into the cornflower blue of her mother's. Old Marta laid her in Eleanor's arms. Mary Adelaide announced from the doorway, vindicated. Mary Hope Hawthorne Silas said, quietly, Mary for the one who came before, hope for the one who came after. Eleanor kissed the top of her daughter's small, dark head. She looked up at her husband. Silas Hawthorne, she said, I think we are going to be all right. Yes, ma'am, Silas said. I think we are. The years began to pass. In the spring of 1881, Eleanor opened a small clinic at Hawthorne Ridge. It was Cassius who built her the cabinet for her father's medical books, which she had finally written for and which had arrived from Boston in a single iron-banded crate, and which she now had in proper order on the shelf where her father had wanted them all along. It was Ezekiel who built her the table where she could examine patients. It was Silas who rode down to Iron Creek and told the town in plain words that his wife had been a doctor's daughter and a doctor's apprentice, and that she would treat any soul on this mountain who needed treating in exchange for whatever they could pay, or for nothing at all if they had nothing at all. Mrs. Pickering of the Welfare Society, who had once stood in the muddy street of Iron Creek and said this is not decent and is not Christian, was the first to come up the mountain. Her grandson had been thrown by a horse and had a leg that was setting badly. Eleanor reset the leg. The boy would walk normally for the rest of his life. Mrs. Pickering came down off the mountain with a basket of empty jam jars she had brought up as a payment, and a face that had been changed by what she had seen in that little clinic. And she went into Mrs. Wexler's boarding house, and she sat down at the long table, and she said very quietly to anyone who would listen, I was wrong about that woman. I was wrong about all of them, and I will say so as long as I live. In the summer of 1881, Cassius Hawthorne courted a young widow from Iron Creek named Verity Bellamy. She was 26 with 2 children of her own, and a face like a careful statement, and a laugh like a creek breaking up at the spring thaw. Cassius had not in his entire 40 years courted anyone. He went about it like a man learning a new trade. He brought her wildflowers that he had ridden 11 miles to pick. He brought her a fish that he had caught with his own hands and cleaned with his own knife. He brought her on the day he asked her father for permission a small iron horseshoe he had hammered out himself and inscribed on the inside of the curve with the words for luck but mostly for love. Verity said yes. They were married in October. She moved up the mountain with her 2 children, and the cabin was extended again, a new wing built off the breezeway, and the population of Hawthorne Ridge swelled to 12. In the spring of 1882, Eleanor and Silas had their second child, a boy whom they named Theodore Whitmore Hawthorne after Eleanor's father. Theo was a quiet baby with steady, honey-colored eyes that were unmistakably his father's, and he was Silas's favorite shadow from the day he learned to walk, and the sight of an enormous bearded mountain man crossing a meadow with a tiny boy hanging onto 2 of his fingers became, in those years, one of the regular sights of Hawthorne Ridge. In 1884, Ezekiel Hawthorne, who had not so much as looked at a woman since his fiancée had died on a stagecoach robbery 7 years earlier, was hired by the new schoolhouse at the edge of Iron Creek to deliver a wagon load of split firewood for the winter. The school teacher was a young woman named Cordelia Sinclair, who had come west from Philadelphia and who had been hired because no one else in 3 counties would teach 40 children of mixed ages in a single room. She was 28. She had freckles and red hair and a laugh like a small bell. She watched Ezekiel unload the firewood, and she heard him whistle very softly while he worked, and she said Mr. Hawthorne was that Shenandoah. Ezekiel set down the last log. He looked at her. He said, yes, ma'am. It is my favorite, she said. It is mine, too, he said. They were married the following spring. Cordelia moved up the mountain. The cabin was extended a 3rd time. Hawthorne Ridge, which had begun as a fortress of grief, built by 3 brothers for a family they had not yet had, was now a small village of its own. In 1888, Adelaide Hawthorne, who had been a fierce-eyed 7-year-old standing in the mud at Iron Creek on the day Eleanor came, was 16 years old and reading her stepmother's medical books faster than Eleanor could acquire new ones. and she announced on her 16th birthday that she intended to be the first woman doctor in Colorado Territory. Eleanor laughed and cried at once and wrote that very night to a school in Philadelphia where her father had once taught. In 1889, Tobias Hawthorne, 25 years old now, with shoulders as broad as his uncle's and the beginning of a beard the color of dark oak, married a young Irish immigrant woman named Imogen O'Brien, whose family had come to Iron Creek as railroad laborers and whose hands were as work-hardened as his own. The wedding was held in the Great Hall at Hawthorne Ridge. Eleanor stood in the place where a mother stands, and she watched her oldest son say his vows, and she remembered the night he had ridden down a mountain on a useless errand to defend her and had come back believing he had failed. She thought, Tobias, you have never failed at a single thing that mattered. She did not say it aloud. He knew. Whitman Hawthorne, who had been 10 months old on the day Eleanor first warmed milk for him in a tin cup, grew into a tall, serious boy with his Uncle Cassius's mouth and his stepmother's eyes, and at 12 he announced that he intended to be a blacksmith and a farrier like his uncle, and Cassius wept very quietly into his coffee that morning when no one was looking, except for Eleanor, who saw because Eleanor always saw. Jasper, who had been 4 years old and coughing on the night Eleanor first arrived, did not die of his lungs as Eleanor had feared in the dark hours of those first winters. He grew strong and lean and quiet. He took in his teenage years to following Ezekiel around with a fiddle Ezekiel had bought him for his 14th birthday, and at 19, he played at his stepsister Adelaide's medical school graduation in Philadelphia before 300 people, and Eleanor sat in the front row and watched her two oldest daughters become between them the future of the family. The years went by the way years do on a mountain. There were hard winters. There was a bad summer in 1886 when a drought killed half the stock, and the brothers borrowed against the homestead and rebuilt the herd by autumn. There was a fire in the forge in 1890 that took Cassius's eyebrows off and gave them all a story they would tell for 30 years afterward. There was a black diphtheria year in 1892 that Eleanor and Adelaide fought together side by side in the clinic that had become 2 clinics now, and they lost 3 children of Iron Creek and saved 14, and Eleanor, who had not wept since her father's funeral except on her wedding day, wept for the 3. There were births, many of them. There were weddings. There was in 1894 the death of Sheriff Hollister, 80 years old, in his bed at the boarding house surrounded by half the county. He had asked in his last week if the Hawthorne brothers would be his pallbearers. They had said yes. They had carried him down the aisle of the Iron Creek Methodist Church, 4 abreast, with Tobias as the 4th, and they had buried him on the hill above the town where he had asked to be put. In 1899, Silas Hawthorne was 58 years old. Eleanor was 44. The high white peaks above Hawthorne Ridge were the same ones that had stood there 20 years before when a Boston girl had stepped off a train with $2 in her hand and a letter against her heart. The cabin was no longer a cabin. The village was no longer small. There were 48 people who lived now full-time on what they all still called the Ridge, although the original cabin was now only the Great Hall at the center of a much larger compound. There were 3 forges. There were 2 clinics. There was a small one-room school that Cordelia Hawthorne ran for the children of the family, supplemented by 12 more children whose parents brought them up from the valley each morning. There were chickens and cattle and sheep and a bee yard that was Adelaide's hobby and Whitman's pride. On a morning in late September of that year, Silas and Eleanor Hawthorne stood on the porch of the Great Hall and watched their grandchildren chase each other through a meadow of late wildflowers. Eleanor's hair had silver in it, now threaded through the honey gold. Silas's was almost entirely white. The scar on his cheek had faded to the color of old ivory. He had needed that winter a new pair of boots because the soles of his old ones had finally given out after 24 years of mountain wear. The new boots, like the old ones, had been made by his grandson, who was Tobias and Imogen's eldest, a boy of 9 named Silas, after his grandfather. Across the meadow, their daughter Mary Hope, who was 19 now, was reading aloud from a letter to her brother Theodore, who was 17, and to her cousins, who were a dozen of various ages spread over the grass. The letter was from Adelaide in her 3rd year of medical practice in Denver, where she had become the first woman to be admitted to the Colorado Territory Medical Association. The letter was full of news about a difficult childbirth she had attended and a paper she was writing on the prevention of childbed fever, and a young surgeon named Mr. Edward Clark, whom she described as exceedingly tedious in a way that Eleanor read between the lines to mean she had decided to marry him by Christmas. Adelaide had always been able to make a decision faster than she could write a letter explaining it. Silas put a hand at the small of his wife's back. Eleanor leaned into it. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said quietly. Mr. Hawthorne, she said, do you remember? She knew without asking. She always knew without asking. I remember, she said. The mud, he said. The mud, she agreed. The $2. Yes, Mrs. Wexler. God rest her, Eleanor said. Mrs. Wexler had died 3 years before, after spending the last decade of her life as a regular caller at the Ridge, where she had been adopted by Adelaide as a kind of unofficial grandmother, and where she had finally, in her 60s, learned how to laugh. Sheriff Hollister, Silas said. God rest him too, Eleanor said. Pemberton. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Cornelius Pemberton had died in a Massachusetts state prison 11 years earlier of pneumonia after serving 9 years of a 15-year sentence for the attempted murder of a citizen of the territory of Colorado. Eleanor had not attended the funeral. She had not been informed in time. She had read of it in a Boston newspaper that had reached her 4 months later, and she had set the paper down on the kitchen table, and she had thought very clearly, you are dead, sir, and I am alive, and that is the end of you in this story. Pemberton, she said. Yes, I remember. Silas shook his head slowly. He looked out at the meadow. His grandchildren were piling onto each other now, a small heap of laughter and limbs. I almost did not write that letter, he said. The advertisement, Mrs. Whitmore. The whole thing, I almost did not. Cassius wanted me to. Ezekiel wanted me to. Adelaide, she was 4 years old. She demanded I do it. But I almost did not. Why, Eleanor asked. She had asked him this question in different forms, perhaps 50 times in 20 years. He had never quite answered. He had always answered something next to it. He answered it now because he said quietly, I was afraid that if I asked God for a second life, he would give it to me, and I was not sure I deserved one. Eleanor turned her face up to him. You deserved one, she said. I know that now, Silas said. You taught me that, ma'am. You and the children, and the years. Below them, at the edge of the meadow, Cassius Hawthorne, 58 years old and almost completely bald, was teaching his 5-year-old grandson how to hold a hammer. Verity, his wife, sat on a quilt with the youngest grandchildren around her, telling a story Eleanor could not hear but knew by the gestures was the story of how Uncle Cassius had once tried to ride a buffalo, which was a story that was not even slightly true and which the grandchildren demanded once a week. Beyond them, Ezekiel Hawthorne, harmonica in his pocket as always, was walking with Cordelia, his wife. They were not young anymore. They held hands. They had, in their 14 years of marriage, never once been seen apart on the Ridge if they could help it. Tobias, who would be 35 next month, came out of the schoolhouse with Imogen at his side and a baby on his shoulder, his 4th child born only 6 weeks before. He saw his stepmother on the porch. He raised his free hand. Eleanor raised hers in return. She thought my oldest son, my boy, who rode out for nothing on a winter day 20 years ago and broke against my shoulder when he came back. My boy who could not believe for the longest time that I would not send him away. My boy who is the reason this family is what it is today, because every other child in this family learned by watching what happened to him that no one in this house gets sent away. She thought you went, Tobias. That is what I will remember. She had told him so in those exact words every year on the anniversary of his foolish ride. He had let her for the first 10 years with a kind of patient embarrassment. He had begun in the 11th year to laugh. He had begun in the 15th year to tell his own children about it as a story not of failure, but of a boy learning late and hard the only lesson that matters, which is that going matters more than arriving. Silas drew Eleanor closer. Mrs. Hawthorne. Mr. Hawthorne. Are you sorry? He asked very quietly. After all of it. After all the years and the hard winters and the boys and the bullets and the fevers and the fires. Are you sorry, ma'am, that you came up the mountain? Eleanor did not answer at first. She watched her grandchildren in the wildflowers. She watched her sons at work. She watched her sisters-in-law on their quilt and her daughter-in-law in the doorway. She watched the smoke rising from 3 chimneys against the blue of a Colorado September sky. She thought of a girl in a navy blue dress in the mud at Iron Creek, 24 years old, $2 in her hand, no home in any direction. She thought of a man in a black hat who had stepped down off a horse and taken off his hat and made himself small in the only way a man of his size could make himself small, and had said her name as if her name were something fragile he had been entrusted with. She thought the only thing I am sorry for is that I did not come sooner. But she had said that to him many times before. She did not say it again. She said something else instead, something she had thought 1,000 times and had never until this morning found exactly the right way to say. Silas, she said. Yes, ma'am. You once told me on this porch that you wanted to be buried beside me under a Colorado pine with our names on the same stone and a long dash between them that means we live together. Yes, ma'am. I remember. I have changed my mind about the stone, she said quietly. He went very still. I do not want to dash Mr. Hawthorne. I want them to write a sentence on it. I want them to write here, lie Silas and Eleanor Hawthorne. They came to this mountain alone. They left it together, and every soul on this ridge is a piece of what they made. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Yes, ma'am, he said at last. He did not trust his voice for more than that. Eleanor turned to him. She put both her hands on his face, the way she had put her hands on Tobias's face once on a porch, and the way she had put her hands on 20 other faces of children and grandchildren in 20 years of motherhood. She kissed him lightly on the corner of his mouth. The kiss was the same kiss he had given her at her wedding in 1879 on a winter morning by a stone hearth in a hall full of people who loved her. The whole kiss took perhaps 2 seconds. Eleanor would remember it her whole life. She had perhaps 18 years of life left, although neither of them knew that yet, and she would die in the same feather bed in the same room that had once been Mary's, with her husband holding her hand, and her last clear thought would be, I came up the mountain. But that was for later. For now, on this morning in September of 1899, on a porch overlooking a meadow full of grandchildren, a man and a woman stood together with 20 years of marriage between them and watched a family that had not existed when they began. Below in the meadow, Adelaide's letter was passed to Mary Hope, who began to read it again from the beginning because the children had demanded it. Cassius's grandson finally got the hammer right and drove the nail straight on the first true blow, and Cassius let out a whoop that startled the chickens. Ezekiel began very softly to play his harmonica. The tune was Shenandoah. It was always Shenandoah eventually. Up on the porch, Silas Hawthorne put his arm around his wife. We did we not, ma'am? We did, Mr. Hawthorne. We made a family. We made a family. And the mountain. The mountain helped, Eleanor said. It taught us how. But we did the building. The mountain only held the boards. Silas laughed. It was a soft, unhurried laugh, the laugh of a man who had earned every laugh he ever had. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said. Yes. I want all of you, he said. All of you. Every winter you have left, and every spring you have left. Every laugh and every weeping, every quiet morning and every long, noisy supper. Every doctoring you have done and every doctoring you have left to do. Every grandchild and every great-grandchild we are going to have. I want all of you, ma'am. The same as the day I said it in the mud at Iron Creek. The same as forever. Eleanor leaned her head against his chest. You have all of me, she said softly. You have had all of me, sir, since the morning I held your youngest at the hearth and you stood in this hall and did not have words. I have all of you too. And we will keep each other as long as the snow falls, as long as the spring comes back, as long as winter ends, Mr. Hawthorne, which it always does, Silas said. The wind moved softly across the meadow. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a harmonica played the old, slow tune of a country that had never been a country, and a family that had not by blood been a family, and was by every other measure that mattered the truest family any of them had ever known. And on the porch of the great hall at Hawthorne Ridge in the high country of Colorado, on a morning that smelled of wildflowers and pine resin and bread baking in 3 different ovens at once, a man and a woman who had once been strangers in the mud of Iron Creek stood with their arms around each other, and they were not sorry, and they were not afraid, and they were my friends exactly where they had always been meant to be, which was, of course, home. She came west with nothing. She found everything. That my friends is the story. It is not the only one I will tell you. There will be others. There will always be others, because the frontier, like a good marriage, is a country full of stories that have not yet been told. But this one was Eleanor and Silas Hawthorne. This one was Cassius and Ezekiel and Tobias and Adelaide and Jasper and Whitman. This one was Reverend Ainsworth and Sheriff Hollister and old Marta Lindquist and Mrs. Pickering, who learned to be wrong out loud, and Mrs. Wexler, who learned to laugh. And this one was a mountain and a winter and a wedding band of cold rolled iron with a single small piece of mountain turquoise, the color of a high lake at dawn. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story warmed your heart the way a good fire warms a cold cabin, hit that like button. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And tell me in the comments below where in the world you were listening from. Sleep well, my friends. The fire is banked, the door is shut, winter always ends, and spring always comes. Good night.